Hello and welcome to this video where I talk to you about the context, the background of Blood Brothers, the GCSE English literature play. Right, so remember when we're talking about context, it's only worth 6 marks, okay? And it's important that when you're talking about context, that you make it relevant, that you ultimately just sort of link it to your main ideas, okay? That's the most important thing. But here are some certain things. So obviously a lot of the play is about class. And when we're talking about class, we're talking about the British class system. This is not something that's written down. It's kind of part of, I guess, the fabric of society. Now, class changes throughout time. We're looking at the period 1950 roughly to 1970, more or less. We're talking about a play that is influenced and written in the 80s, influenced by Thatcher, the British Prime Minister, first female Prime Minister. Obviously, one of her main legacies was her she dismantled a lot of the states, the British state. So, for example, things like the coal mines, things like our kind of strategic reserves, all of these sort of things. She would have seen it as pushing Britain into the 21st century. But of course, what this meant was a lot of cuts, a lot of people out of work, and it was sort of a culmination of this particular period. The reason I mention this is because obviously class, the people who bore the brunt of a lot of these changes were the working classes. And they always seem to be, at least to people like Willie Russell, second in the mind of people like Thatcher and even prime ministers before her. So what we're talking about really is this kind of exploitation of working class people, at least in the view of Russell. Okay, so if you're writing about Mickey and Edward, that's kind of what you're writing about. Other key important parts of context would obviously be the city of Liverpool. This is a traditionally kind of Labour city. But of course, it's a city of industry. As I mentioned, the industry was on the decline. Seems like the perfect place to sort of set the play. Of course, Willie Russell, in terms of context, the playwright, he had his own working class upbringing. By and large, he's discussed in the past when he thinks of his memories, what he really remembers is his mother, his grandmother, these kind of matriarchal figures, and their influence on his life. That obviously comes out through characters like Mrs. Johnston. And also, I guess when we're thinking about context, what we're thinking about is education. Okay, the education system. So obviously, we're talking about state versus private grammar. Excuse me. We're also talking about public schools. Essentially, that these are the ones that they're non-selective. The standard of education tended to be quite poor. That's obviously where Mickey goes. And this is obviously where Edward goes. And we see that the kind of education that you receive sort of dictates, ultimately, corresponds to your life chances and your outcomes. So again, very light touch with context because we're not writing history essays here. If you're talking about Mickey and Edward, if you're talking about Mrs. Johnson, these are the kind of things that you may well bring in a sentence or two to cover those context marks. Thank you for listening.